We have a special offer for our faithful listeners. The promo code podcast20 takes 20% off of the tuition for our exciting on-demand e-learning courses. The code is good through December 2024. The lineup includes Sewing with Wool by Katrina Walker and classics by Kenneth D. King and other trusted sewing instructors. You can count on Thread's expertise in these online on-demand learning experiences. Learn at your own pace anytime you want to log in. Check out the lineup at threadsmagazine.com/elearning and don't forget to apply the code podcast20 for your 20% discount. Hello, and welcome to Sewing with Threads, the monthly podcast from the staff of Threads Magazine. I'm your host, Sarah McFarland. I'm Threads editorial director, and my guest for this episode is the multi-talented Katrina Walker. Thank you for joining me, Katrina.
Thank you, Sarah.
Katrina is a repeat guest. She was on episode 23 back in 2019, and at that time we talked about machine embroidery. And today I wanted to talk to Katrina about another area of expertise for her, and that is wool, that wonderful fiber that so many sewists and knitters too love to work with. And Katrina, can you tell us first about your connection with wool and where your expertise comes from?
Sure. I was very fortunate to actually grow up on a farm, but I confess that I think we had every kind of livestock except wool growing up. But I was always completely fascinated by when we go to the county fair, there would be a big spinning demonstration. There'd always be ladies sitting there spinning on their spinning wheels. And I was completely enthralled as a kid. But it never occurred to me this was something I could do as an adult. But then I won't bore you with all the in-between details, but I found myself in my mid-20s running a 4-H program for a county on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. Well, technically the Quimper Peninsula, but you know, who's counting? But anyhow, it also enclosed the Olympics. So so I found myself working with kids with livestock again. And of course, some of those kids had wool sheep, wool breeds of sheep. There's 2 different kinds of sheep, actually, or, you know, obviously there's actually around 1,000 breeds worldwide, but there's 2 main categories depending on their main purpose, the reason that they're raised, and wool being one of them. And then, of course, other lamb products being the other. But anyhow, so it really kind of brought me back into the fold, so to speak. And I had to learn a lot more about, I should back up. So, you know, during that time, I actually had pursued a master's degree in clothing and textiles. And so I'd had textile science and things. So, you know, I'd learned some about wool in the meantime. But anyhow, so that really kind of brought me into it and brought me into the world of, in Western Washington especially, of sheep production and wool production. And then flash forward, after that, I found myself actually working in raw materials for Nordstrom Product Group. And so, of course, working with textiles and yarns there, because I basically, any raw material that went into a product, be it a sweater or a suit or what have you, passed through my desk to be cataloged into our system for the sake of customs and Homeland Security and all kinds of things. It's really kind of bizarre what you actually have to track raw materials for these days. But so that kind of took it to another level. And then I had the good fortune to, during my tenure at Nordstrom, compete in and win the adult division of the National Make It with Wool competition. So that was a big deal to me. It was a very happened to be a low point in my life. And so wool was a very sentimental thing for me to win that competition. And it really kind of helped launch my career in the sewing world as a sewing professional. And that's what the turn that my career path took next, was to enter the world of being a sewing professional and on for various things. But because of my 4-H work, and working with kids, my husband's niece got involved in 4-H while I was working, and she had a flock of Romney sheep that came to her after a llama died, and the remaining llama went into grief. And so my poor brother-in-law was didn't know what to do. And I said, don't worry, I'll find you a sheep. And so I got a hold of people that I knew that had a flock of
So there's
Romneys.
a llama sheep companionship connection.
Well, yeah, exactly. So she got into sheep because we needed to keep her llama from dying of grief. And so, because they bond. And so they have to have something. So the llama went from being seriously dejected to, perking up and spitting at the sheep and snapped out of it. So this was a champion flock out of Western Washington, and just the nicest people. So I knew them through the 4-H world, and I was heavily involved with the Washington State Fair and the Washington State 4-H Fair at that time. And so they said, yeah, we have, this ewe that, was, she's getting older and her lamb passed and she doesn't have anything to do. She says, we'll sell it to you for $50, which, believe me, $50 is so incredible. This was definitely like beyond friends and family. This was basically, we're giving you a sheep, but we're going to charge you something for it. And that sheep started my niece's flock, started my flock. She lived to be probably 14. She was still winning in the show ring at 10 years old. The judge would have a fit. Because he would ask my niece, this wasn't necessarily a big show that she was showing in, but, she still looked good. So we entered her in the, aged you. Extremely aged ewe category. And by golly, she won it. And the judge is like, oh, how old is your ewe? And my niece is like, oh, she's 10. And the judge about, spits out his teeth, because he just can't believe that he just gave an award to an ancient sheep. But she looked good and she loved going to the fair. And so Harriet started the whole thing. And then when my husband and I moved to the ranch here, our very small by Washington Stan, Eastern Washington Stan is our very small ranch here in Eastern Washington. We brought her flock with us, this little foundation flock of purebred Romneys, and then I started my flock. So it just, and I've been working with that, working with the Washington sheep producers, helping with the Washington Make It with Wool program, of course, promoting wool through that, promoting wool through 4-H, used to be able to be involved with, in the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot of really great fiber festivals, as you do, of course, there near you, Sarah, in upstate New York. But it's a really great place to, if you're interested in wool and things, we have a lot of opportunities for people to learn. And here in the Spokane area, we have more spinning guilds and that sort of thing. But so I've gone from being just an admirer and then a textile geek and admiring it from that point to working with the sheep, with the kids and the animals, and then now being a wool producer for the last 12 years or so. So it's been kind of the whole gamut, I guess you would say.
Yeah. I think that that's something unique about wool, is that not only does it have so many wonderful qualities to work with, but I feel it has this sort of romantic, fun backstory to it, because you think of the wonderful animals. And I know at your farm, and your website is spoiledsheep.com. I love seeing the pictures of your animals. They all have names. You have a great description of, what their life is like. And do you feel that, happy sheep make better wool?
Absolutely. Well, there is some evidence to the contrary, in the sense that those merinos that they run in Australia, actually, that's something called, there's a phrase or a term called starvation fine. Now, these sheep are not being starved. That does not mean that they are being starved. But what it means is that actually the poorer the feed, like the harder the sheep has to work at finding food, like I said, not starving, but, they actually have to make an effort, unlike my flock. Actually, the finer the clips. So yes and no. I mean, I think happy wool is the best wool, but if I really wanted my sheep to have really fine wool, I'd put them on really horrible pasture. But no, it's spoiled sheep for a reason. They are the most spoiled flock on the planet. And people are, why don't you have we have livestock guardian dogs to protect them from predators. And they work, round the clock. They work with the sheep, but they're not herding dogs. And people, why don't you have a herding dog? I said, all I have to do is blow my special whistle and they all come running. It's like, all I have to do is shake a bucket of grain and say, sheep, sheep, and they follow me wherever I want to take them. So it's like, why do I need to chase them with a dog? So I really don't have to do that. I am the shepherdess. They love me. They know me. I mean, I helped bring many of them into the world. They, it's not an issue. So yes, they are so spoiled. But yeah, I think Happy Wool is best. And they do on the website. I'm glad you were amused, because it was fun putting it together, and they really do have a good life, and they're very, 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 very spoiled.
Now, you mentioned sheep and wool festivals, and there are definitely some wonderful ones in upstate New York. I'm looking forward to going to Rhinebeck, the New York State Sheep and Wool Festival later this month. And what are some of the festivals in your neck of the woods?
In our neck of the woods, in spring, there's the Shepherd's Extravaganza that's part of the spring fair on the Washington State Fairgrounds in Puyallup. That's a really fun one. We also have, there's also most of them are in the fall. So we have, just like Rhinebeck and Maryland, there's the Oregon, I think it's the OFFF, the Oregon Flock and Fiber Festival. And then there's I don't know why I have a hard time spitting that one out. And then there's the Black Sheep. Black Sheep Gathering is a big one. And it was down in Eugene. I think they've moved it since. It's been a few years since I've been able to go. But that's a big one. Black Sheep. In fact, actually, my foundation flock, most of my sheep, in fact, all of them that I added to my Romneys, I actually picked up at Black Sheep. I arranged with the shepherds to pick them up at the show. There's a big one at the Evergreen State Fairgrounds in Monroe, Washington, and I'm pretty sure that's in the fall as well. The Washington State Fair has a huge sheep show, and there's a lot of wool breeds. There's both wool and down breeds, but mostly wool breeds. And there's a big, fairly illustrious competition, or at least it's a significant bragging rights called the Puyallup Cup. So the fair is in Puyallup, Washington, and if you're local, if you can say it correctly. So the Puyallup Cup is for basically it's like best of show. Like if you have a dog show, you've got best of show. It's basically best of show for sheep breeds. And so you'll have basically the best of their breed for the whole show, which is usually pretty significant. There's usually it's a big turnout, a lot of breeds represented. And then, of course, they take the best of the best from that. And that's really a wonderful, wonderful thing to witness, because a lot of fiber festivals don't necessarily have a sheep show where you can see the different breeds, represented and competing against each other, and that's something a little different. But yeah, and then I'm sure that there's many that I'm forgetting. But again, the local spinners guilds always are having spin-ins where we get together and spin together, and those are always a ton of fun. And just like knitting guilds, we have spinning guilds. So we sit and spin. It's really kind of relaxing. So those are a few in the area. Like I said, I know there's more, but that's what comes off the top of my head.
Katrina, you mentioned there are so many different breeds of sheep. Why are there so many different breeds of sheep, and what are some of the variations in their fleeces that are important?
Oh, that's an excellent question. The reason there's about 1,000 breeds of sheep currently in circulation worldwide is because, number one, there's many climates on this planet. And so there's basically a sheep for every climate. And you think about it, sheep have evolved with humanity. Humanity could not have explored all the places that we've managed to learn to live in without sheep. In that sheep provide us with food, they provide us with shelter, they're easy to care for, they don't take up a lot of space, they can eat just about anything, they'll eat things that even cattle and horses can't graze on. So they're very, very versatile, and our survival as a species is very much linked with sheep. I think that's part of that, you're talking about the romanticism. I think that there's an instinctive bonding with sheep, I think, for humanity. But anyhow, so to go back to that, so basically there's a sheep for every purpose too. And so if you want a pair of socks, for example, like for instance, the Lincoln breed, is historically one that is able to make very durable sock yarn. And it's just something that they've always excelled in. Obviously you can use Lincoln for other things, but, we categorize wool we have our coarse, fine, and medium designations for wool. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about those designations. For example, I have Wensleydale and Romney sheep in my flock, and I've had Gotlands, and I've got Finn crosses. And so those are all Leicester Longwool I've had. So those are all technically considered coarse. And so people immediately start itching, right? Because they think, oh gosh, coarse wool. But the funny thing is that actually plenty of people knit sweaters next to the skin out of my Romney yarn, and it doesn't itch at all. And so there's more to it than simply, the diameter. That the coarse, medium, and fine just refers to the diameter of the individual wool fiber. And so it doesn't necessarily mean it's poor quality or that it's itchy, but that's the perception that comes about. But a lot of it has to do, again, to go with the climate. So for example, here in Eastern Washington, I can have a lot of different breeds of sheep because it's not particularly wet. We do get snow, but it's not particularly wet here. But in Western Washington, one of the reasons why Romney Marsh sheep, they come from the Kent region in England, which is where the Romney Marshes are. They have been bred and they've evolved over the centuries so that they have a fleece that remains uniformly fluffy at all times. And that uniform fluffiness means that all that rain and drizzle just rolls right off their back. So if you gently stick your hands into the fleece of a Romney, they're always nice and dry, toasty and dry under there. Whereas like my Wensleydales, funny, they come from the British Isles too, but some breeds of sheep have fleeces that will split. They'll part just like when you part your hair on your head, but their fleeces will actually part. Well, when their fleeces part down their back, that exposes their skin, and they can actually get chilled, and they can be more susceptible to having issues if they're out in really, really drizzly weather. So, and the Romneys also resist foot rot, which is an issue when you're on wet soil with sheep all the time. They're resistant to a lot of things. So a lot of it is climate. In fact, the Merinos, for example, the Spanish, believe it or not, it was a capital offense to have a Merino outside of Spain. They would kill you if you managed to smuggle a Merino sheep out of Spain. Capital offense. But the Spanish over time convinced themselves that Merinos could not possibly thrive anywhere outside of Spain. Only Spain had the right climate for Merinos to thrive. And so at one point, they gave a gift to the King of France for his stud at Rambouillet, and now we have Rambouillets, which are basically, I don't have Merino crosses, but I have Rambouillet crosses, because Rambouillets, for some reason, are actually much more suited to range conditions here in the West. Rambouillets, we use Rambouillet rams on commercial flocks to improve the clip. And so I actually have quite a few Rambouillet crosses. I used a Rambouillet ram on my flock to improve the clip. Australia happens to have the perfect, nice, dry, hot climate, similar to parts of Spain. So obviously Merinos do really well there. So there's certain kinds of sheep that, do well in some areas, but not in others. And it's because they've been adapted to the climate. But the bottom line, sorry, I know I ramble on when it comes to sheep and wool, but the bottom line is that there's a sheep for every purpose. There is a type of wool for every purpose. And sadly, right now, the only word anybody knows is merino, and it has devastated the wool market because that's the only kind of wool that anybody wants to buy. It's the only word they recognize. And the other day someone said, oh, I have this, undershirt. I love that it's wool and it's washable because it's merino. And I just kind of put my head in my hands like, no, that's not why it's washable. Washable wool is washable because they coat it with a resin to keep the scales from lifting, and or you can singe it, but usually it's resin coated. It's like, no, they basically coat it in plastic, so to speak, and that's why you can wash it. It has nothing to do with the breed. But in their head, the marketing's been really good that, oh, merino is washable. Well, all wool is washable. But, anyway, it's very frustrating as a sheep producer sometimes.
Actually, Katrina, I had made some notes that I wanted to ask you about sort of the perceived drawbacks, or I feel there's some misconceptions about wool. And one was, is wool inherently scratchy? Is there such a thing as a wool allergy? Why is there sometimes that perception that wool's going to be uncomfortable against your skin?
Well, that's an excellent question. And, frankly, all of us had those Woolrich sweaters back in the 80s. Well, I shouldn't say all of us over a certain age certainly had those itchy sweaters. So it can't say that it doesn't exist, but it is something that, well, as I said, I mean, I grow Romneys and they're a coarse wool breed, but some of them are so super soft that you would never guess, oh gosh, this is a coarse wool. It's perfectly soft. And I think it boils down to several variations. Well, one is there's a lot of variation yarn-wise in terms of the clip length. So if you only shear your sheep once a year like I do, they're going to have a staple length meaning the length of the piece of fleece. They're going to have a staple length for my flock of somewhere between, 4 to 6 inches. Well, actually, I have some Wensleydales that'll grow more like 10 inches in a year. But for the ones that get processed into yarn and don't go to, specialty spinners, you're looking at a longer clip. So the longer the clip, in my experience, generally that's a better quality. It's more expensive. If you can shear a sheep twice a year and get yarn out of it, obviously you're going to produce more product. It's more financially viable, but a longer clip helps. The other thing that can make a difference too is how it's processed. So most commercial yarn goes through a process called carbonization. And what that means, so yarn, wool has a strong, it's very resistant to acids. And so what they'll do is they'll take the raw fleece and they will dip it in a hydrochloric acid solution, and then they heat it up, and that literally burns out all of the vegetable matter. So we call it VM, vegetable matter. All the weeds and hay and everything that's still sticking in that fleece literally gets chemically burned out of the wool, and then it goes into regular processing. So the carbonization process does tend to dry out the wool more so. So whereas like my flock, I have to carefully hand pick all that vegetable matter out of their fleeces, which, believe me, is not a lot of fun. That's why I shear late in the year, so that they're hopefully as free of vegetable matter as possible. And so I have to pick all that out. And so as a result, when you touch a skein of my yarn, it actually feels slightly cool to the touch. It's not greasy, but you can feel there's still lanolin in it because it's only been washed in soap and water. It hasn't been through the harsher processes that a commercial clip will go through. And there just isn't, you couldn't afford to buy wool normally. My yarn is not cheap because there's the labor into it, and it's hand processed sheep by sheep by, each bag of wool from each shearing is processed individually. So it's expensive to produce, but it's worth it to me. But anyhow, so that also affects, I believe, very much so when you touch the yarns, you can feel the difference. So that can also affect it. There's been a lot of work, wool today, within the last, say, 30, 40 years. Wool today, I would say, is much higher quality than wool was earlier, during the 20th century, because there's been so much work put into improving the clip of these commercial and range flocks. There's been so much more work put into the genetics, where it used to be basically, any wool would do, and we're always going to have wools that are only used for carpets. So again, a sheep for every purpose. There are sheep that just produce carpet wool. The sheep that the Diné raised down in the Southwest, they're going to use that for carpets and things. They're not meant to go next to your skin. That's not what they're bred for. But you need something you can walk on without it wearing out, and you can't do that with merino. So anyhow, so I know I'm rambling. I'm circling back around, but there's just a lot of different factors. But I think that, is there such thing as a wool allergy? There are people with extremely sensitive skin. There's no two ways about it. I have a friend who says she's allergic to lanolin. That's pretty rare because lanolin actually is chemically the most similar to our own skin oil. That's why purified pharmaceutical grade lanolin is very good for you, because it's the most like actual human, maybe that's gross to people, but the most like human skin oil, there is. It actually apparently smells exactly the same, the whole bit. Not really going to gross people out, but at any rate, it's, so, if you're allergic to lanolin that's been purified, as in gone through, quite a purification process, I would think it would be very difficult to be allergic to that, but it doesn't mean that, I mean, let's face it, some people are so sensitive, they're basically allergic to the air. So, which is really awful for them. I'm so grateful not to be that way.
Yeah.
But, with wool, I do think there's a certain psychological element too. I think you could probably sneak wool into something for most people. They'd be happily wearing it until they found out it was wool, and then they'd suddenly start to break out in hives. So, it just depends. Again, every person's different, just like every sheep is different. But I do think that there's a lot of factors to it. I mean, the quality of the wool, and when it's sheared, right down to the kind of processing it's been through, and, whatever's been applied or not applied to it, and all that good stuff. It all has an influence on the final product. Just like, out in my flock, I could have a flock of all the same breed, and each fleece is going to be different. It's so unique, and every animal is unique. So hopefully that answered your question. I'm not sure. I kind of rambled for a bit there.
Oh, no, thank you. It did. And another factor, and you touched on this a little bit when you're talking about merino wool, but it's how do you avoid shrinking wool? You make a beautiful wool garment. How do you prepare the fabric beforehand? And I do have a question from our social media. Someone asked specifically about pre-shrinking wool. How do you go about it for those of us who don't have a steam generating iron, nor a dry cleaner who will steam wool?
So it takes 3 things to shrink wool: moisture, heat, and agitation. So there's 3 factors: moisture, heat, and agitation. So I personally do not enjoy dyeing wool. And especially not in the fleece. I've had to do it. I don't enjoy it. But, for some dyes, some acid dyes, and acid dyes, it sounds scary, but they're actually usually the least toxic. I've known people to accidentally drink acid dye, and, they're now in their 90s. So it's not, obviously not super toxic. They didn't enjoy the experience, but they didn't die or get sick. So, so sometimes you basically have to boil the fleece in the dye to get it to really set. And you just have to let it cool. You just basically touch it as little as possible. You try to just it's okay for it to be in there. But what happens is, so wool shrinks for mechanical reasons. There's different reasons why fibers shrink. Like cotton shrinks because the fibers themselves literally swell up with water. And as the fiber gets wider, they get shorter. And so that's why cotton shrinks, because it's kind of like pantyhose, if you remember those. As you stretch it out, it gets skinny. And as you they come out of the egg, they're shorter and wider. And that's kind of how cotton works. But anyway, so with wool is just like our hair. If you've ever played with hair and ratted it up with a comb or run it backwards, you know that it's smooth in one direction and it's rough in the other direction. So those are the overlapping, those keratin scales that form when a follicle grows, just like the hair on your head. And so when those get warm, or in warm, moist environments, they open up, they kind of bloom in a sense. And so now you have this Velcro, like this scaly surface. And so if you agitate them in that state, so when they're warm and there's moisture and those scales are open and you rub them together, they're going to lock. And that's how the shrinkage happens, is those fibers are actually, the scales on each individual fiber are locking together. Now, this is a good thing. This is why we've been able to develop, say, yurts, made out of felt that, protect people from the elements. We've manipulated wool to do this for literally thousands, if not millions of years. I'm not real clear on humanity's timelines, so I have to be kind of vague here. But the point is, people figured out a long time ago, hey, if I stuff a bunch of wool down in my shoe and walk around in it all day, I've got a nice felt pad at the end of the day. So we've done it on purpose. So to avoid that, you can wash wool in warm water and all of that. Obviously it's been around a lot longer than dry cleaning. So you can wash it, but the thing to avoid is agitation. So if I'm washing a bunch of sweaters, what I will usually do is I'll have a bathtub with warm, soapy water, and I let them sit in there until they're cool. I just gently kind of push them down into the suds and just let them soak. And then when things have cooled off, the most danger is gone. And so I'll let it drain. I'll actually take my shower head and rinse them off a lot of times and let that run down the drain. I'll squeeze out the excess water as much as I can. maybe I'll roll a towel, but I'll actually go ahead and put it in my washing machine and just spin it. And I'm not agitating, but I will spin the excess water out, and then you need to reshape it. So wool, another thing about wool is that when you let it dry, you need to reshape it, because whatever shape it's in when it dries, and this is true of tailoring too, the reason why tailoring is sculpture is because if you spend all that time, say, shaping a sleeve cap, and you've used moisture and, and you've shaped a beautiful sleeve cap, but then before it's cool and dry, you move it and go set it on your table. Well, guess what? It's no longer going to be your perfectly shaped sleeve cap anymore because
Gonna lose that shape.
was still moist. You need to always reshape. And just like when you knit a sweater, you have to block it. Knitting a sweater, it's not actually done when it's done. It's not done until it's been blocked, which means to set it out in its actual intended shape and let it dry like that. So you have to think about that quality of wool, which is both a plus and a minus. But to go to pre-shrinking your wool, one tool that actually is more readily available now that can be really helpful is you can buy inexpensive hand steamers from, I think I buy them off of Amazon for about $20 a pop. And I actually, when I travel with a little hand steamer, because you really can't trust hotel irons. And for most garments, just to get the travel wrinkles out, a steamer is much more effective than an iron anyway. Unless you're traveling with your hams and all your other pressing tools, you don't want to be pressing it on a flat ironing board anyway, unless it's a flat body part, which how many of those do we have? You don't press it on a flat surface. I mean, this is something that, with my students, it's like, here's the tools. You must have these tools because it's like your body has shapes on it. So you have to press on a shape. But one of the traditional methods for shrinkage that anybody can do at home is, if you have an old sheet or something, or sacrifice one temporarily, is to take like a damp sheet and to actually roll your yardage up in a damp sheet. I think that's actually what they call London shrink. So you can roll it up in a damp sheet and just let it cool. Some people will actually tumble it in the dryer a little bit because, again, heat and moisture. I'm pretty lucky that I have steamers. So I actually found at a swap meet, I found an actual commercial Jiffy steamer. So that works really well. But I mean, honestly, even those little $20 handheld Amazon steamers can do a really good job. But, the traditional, I mean, I've heard of people even throwing damp towels in the dryer with them. But, to me, that just seems like a lint nightmare. So I don't recommend that. But, to roll them up into a damp sheet. And in some cases, you literally can just let them dry that way. That will help. But, it's funny. I've had wool I carefully shrunk and carefully, pressed all through. Well, actually, even my winning Make It With Wool jacket, heaven knows I tailored the heck out of that thing. During construction, my dry cleaner still managed to make it not as it was. They still managed to, I swear, overpress it. If you ever compete a wool garment, do not, number one, don't wear it in between competitions. If it has more than one showing, don't wear it in between. You have to keep it pristine. But number two, don't clean it until it's all done with competition. And most wool garments actually don't need to be cleaned very often. Wool has what we call hygroscopic fiber. So, you might have heard the word hydrophilic, about water loving. Oleophilic, that would be our polyesters that just adore oil of all kinds. Wool is what we call hygroscopic, which means it actually absorbs water vapor, but it doesn't readily absorb water or liquid. So it sucks up water vapor, but not necessarily liquid. And so
it's somewhat naturally stain repellent?
Exactly. Thank you for summing up what I'm blathering around the subject. But yes, so wool is naturally basically stain repellent to a large extent. Most wools can just be literally what we call sponged off. You can take a damp cloth and you can literally just kind of brush. In fact, actually, that's what, if you read a lot of, British literature and they talk about,
that's so funny.
Valet or the maid brushing.
I was thinking about reading, like Charles Dickens novels. See? and characters brushing their suits.
Yes.
And I can remember talking to a friend of mine who was concerned about making some wool garments, because of cleaning. And I was thinking, my wool sweaters, I rarely wash them. It's usually just a brush off.
Yep. You can
process.
just, for
Yep.
most wools, really, unless you've sweated like a pig in them, which pigs don't sweat. But at any rate, that's another story. But unless you've really made them icky, and I do recommend, even if it isn't itchy, I always recommend wearing an undershirt, with your good wools. Uniqlo's a brand I love that does really thin undershirts. But at any rate, but yeah, it's for most wools, a simple damp cloth brush off, or literally brushing. Yeah. In the Victoria era, they literally just brushed them off and give it a good airing. If it's been exposed to cigarette smoke, if it's been, or other kinds of smoke, or, then it's going to take a really good airing. So they will kind of absorb environmental odors. So you do want to air them out. But yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of wool. I mean, wool is such a miracle fiber because in so many ways, it is stain repellent. It is like Irish fishermen's sweaters. The reason they're so warm is because wool is warm even when it's wet. And if it absorbs enough water vapor out of the air, wool actually gives off heat. There's actually a chemical reaction. So those Irish fishermen's sweater out there on the ocean, it's just basically the air is saturated with water. Those sweaters are actually giving off heat because of all of the water vapor in the air and the chemical reaction that occurs. I mean, it's amazing fiber. And then you have them in the desert. So, I mean, wool is also worn in the hottest parts of the world because it gets cold at night, for one thing, but also because of its affinity for vapor, it actually helps to accelerate the perspiration process. And so it can actually help to make the body cool off more efficiently, plus providing, shade, that layer of shade between the cloth and the body. So we're not talking about, a suit lined in polyester here. We're talking about a loosely woven wool, but still, it's adapts to every type of climate. It's just amazing. But yeah, luckily it's actually, in spite of its reputation, I mean, it's been around for thousands of years before dry cleaning. It's actually really easy to take care of.
Hey, Katrina, what's the best way or some strategies for storing wool to prevent moth or bug damage?
Oh, yeah. Don't get bugs in the first place. That's your best bet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Clothing moths like darkness. So they like it dark and they like it quiet. And that's the kind of things they like. I mean, in my case, I live, near the Great White North. So like my fleece barn actually is, it's not heated. So it gets hot in the summer. It gets cold in the winter. It's not perfectly dark during the day. Fleeces they're kept in actually clear plastic bags. As much as I hate plastic, the reality is that it's the best protection for the fleece. Plus it's clear, so the bugs don't like that. So a lot of it is, don't stick them in a dark closet and never look at them except for once a year. The more you can air them out, keep them in circulation, make sure that there isn't any food sticking to them, because anytime you do have food particles and things on your wools, that will attract insects that might not normally eat them. I'm told that actually people have done tests in that lavender actually has a very effective moth repelling properties. They don't like the smell, I guess. I haven't found cedar to be very effective myself, but
All right, no.
I think it dries out too fast for one thing. But lavender, so like all of my sweaters have lavender sachets, packed in around them, just in the hopes of that. You'll find sadly, merino is a big moth target. I have sweaters I've had for years that have never been touched. And then I swear I get a fine merino or a cashmere, and guess what? No matter how many times I, clean out my closet and all that, it's, like I said, for my actual woolens, so my personal stash is actually in non-climate controlled environments, so they freeze off and on all winter long. And so anytime you buy wool from a consignment store or a thrift store or whatever, it's a good idea to throw it in the freezer. Put it in the freezer, take it out, thaw it, throw it in the freezer. Do that a few times, because without damaging the wool, it should kill if there's insect eggs in it. Clothing moth eggs in it. Freezer treatment will do it usually. So it's a good idea to freeze them and then not freeze them.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I did want to ask you, there's an annual 4-H fundraiser in this area. And I always pick up beautiful wool fabrics every year. But there were two things I wanted to ask about. One was, making sure that they didn't have any lingering bugs or moths in them because I don't know the source of them. And the other thing was scents. If you get some vintage wool and it has an odor, what's the best way to take care of that?
Yeah, the dreaded mothball effect, which I get with silk as well. And I'm told the soaking in white vinegar can help take care of it. I would say I've had mixed results on that. Again, with wool, if you have the luxury of being able to kind of lay it out in the sunshine, that can kind of help to fumigate it out a little bit. But boy, that camphor smell, I'm not even sure dry cleaning always takes care of it. Again, you might try soaking it in good old lavender. You might try, I think, eucalyptus and soak. I think some of them have formulations that have lavender or lavender scented, have lavender oil in them. It might be worth a try. Honestly, yeah, mothballs are pretty much the bane of my existence because I buy a lot of vintage textiles. And you're right. There's times when it's not the wool I have problems with so much. It's the silk more so. But some of those old kimonos, I don't think I'll ever get it out of there. But the more that you can air it out, the better. And that's just always a good thing. If you can air it out, let it have some light and some air. Because that's the thing about critter fibers. And this is why I love silk and wool so much, is because to me, they're still alive. They have a life of their own, and and so, we like to have light and air. So I think they do
Yes.
too, and I mean, with silk, you have to be careful because it's UV sensitive, and wool really isn't, but that would be definitely my I mean, number one, give them the good old freezer treatment. If you have the luxury of room in your freezer, do that. It's a good idea. But air them out. Try the white vinegar thing. It won't hurt it. Silk and wool, especially wool, has that affinity for acidity. So it's not going to hurt it to soak it in a good old bath of acetic acid. So you might try white vinegar. That seems to be as effective as anything.
There is a newspaper trick that I have tried for leather with a scent before that I think works pretty well. And that is you take crumpled fresh newspaper and pack the item with the scent in the newspaper in a sealable plastic container. And then you change the newspaper every 3 days or so. And the scent in the item does dissipate. There's something about the fresh newspaper that kind of extracts the scent. So that has worked for me before.
Awesome.
With some leather and some wool items.
Oh, I'll be darned. I'll definitely add that to my repertoire. That's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, does it have to be printed newspaper, or can it just be newsprint paper? Does the ink matter? That's what I want to know.
It does. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the ink might be what's actually helping, kind of like carbon or charcoal.
Yes, exactly. And that's why it seems to work better if it is a fresh newspaper page.
Okay. That makes sense. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. That's fabulous.
You're welcome. Katrina, I just have a couple more questions that came in to us from social media. And one is, do you have any suggestions for making pants? Should they be lined or underlined?
Ooh, that's an excellent question. These days, well, it depends partly. Number one, is it 100% wool, or has it been blended with spandex or similar? So many things are a blend now. If the wool, a lot of wools are blended with nylon because it gives it just that little bit more resiliency. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just depends. I know it's a vague answer. I do like to underline certain things, just because if it's a fine wool where I'm worried about seam imprinting, then underlining can help to cushion the seam allowances. And so that would be an advantage to underlining it, is that you have that secondary ability, especially if you, allow the underlining seam allowances to extend past the seam allowances of the pant. It can really help to prevent those imprints. So especially if it's a competition garment where you're concerned about these things, that can be a real plus of doing the underlining. Plus, also, if you want that support, I mean, I remember, of course, in Threads, we've had some wonderful articles over the years showing silk organza being used as an underlining for some very geometric shaped jackets and things, and to give it that extra support just structurally. So I will use underlining if there's a structural reason to use underlining. If I just want to help keep the wool clean on the inside, protect it from myself, and to help take strain off a certain, some places the lining can help kind of take some of the strain off the fabric, prevent it from straining the wool at the seams. So really, I mean, I would say, so that's kind of my designation is I do like to line or underline, but lining, let's face it, is the quick and dirty way to go. So with the lining, I can just sew the lining, pop it in there, and I don't really have to do anything. And then when I put the waistband on, bam, I'm done, So, obviously lining is kind of the quick and dirty method of choice. But again, I'll use underlining if there's a compelling reason to do so, because it is a lot more time intensive and it's not always necessary, frankly. And, I would think that there'd be a really cool way to, again, since you can basically put the lining in and then when you put the waistband on, that holds everything in place. I bet there'd be a really cool way to basically be able to button your lining in so that you could take the lining out and wash it and then button it back in. I think that should be a future article.
I was going to say, I will put some articles in the show notes for this episode. I'm not sure if we've actually done that technique, but that's a great idea.
I mean, why not?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I have one more question for you. This is from Fashion Sewist. It came in through Instagram, and this is kind of a big question. We'll have to interpret this. How about dyeing wool?
Dyeing wool. Okay. Actually, that's not such a big question in the sense that if the wool has not been treated, okay, so I mean, obviously you can dye wool at any stages. So if you hear that expression dyed in the wool, well, obviously that means that the fleece itself was dyed before wove. So if you're talking about commercial dyeing, the earlier in the stage of production the wool is dyed, the more expensive the garment is, because of course, once that fiber is dyed, it's colored. The cheapest garment, and this is true of all fabric, the cheapest garments are basically produced undyed, and then the final product is dyed. It's piece dyed. So because that way you can make them whatever color you want. You don't have to commit to it, and you can just color the garment. But the earlier in the process that you color the fiber, the more committed you are to the final result. So fiber dyeing is the most expensive textiles. Yarn dyeing is the next most expensive. Yardage dyeing would be next, and then garment dyeing would be the cheapest. So it just depends. But with wool, all you really need to know, well, number one, if it has any kind of finish on it, it may not color well. So unless you know how that, if you're talking about dyeing wool yardage, it's going to vary a lot depending on A, what it's been mixed with, since 100% wool is hard to come by these days. B, because dyes are fiber specific. You have to know your fiber content to know what dyes to use effectively. But the bottom line is what you really want is an acid dye. And so acid dyes are pretty inexpensive. You can find them, like Jacquard makes a great line of acid dyes. Any silk dyes will work for wool. They won't take color as fast or as easy, but they'll work for wool because again, wool resists water. So it's like getting the wool down into the dye is actually kind of the hard part. You wouldn't think so, but it is. And that's why it's hard to get it even. Getting consistent results is the hard part because it's hard to get wool to get dunked down in there in a even manner. That's why I don't like doing it. I just don't. But you want to use acid dyes. That's the long and short of it. But your mileage will vary, depending on, again, if you're dyeing, as 100% wool yarn, that's pretty easy. I mean, you can dye wool using Kool-Aid because Kool-Aid is made with citric acid. So basically, Kool-Aid is basically citric acid, food coloring, and sugar. So the sugar you usually add in. So you want you don't want unsweetened Kool-Aid because that has fake sugar put in it. You want the old fashioned add your own sugar kind because then what you're basically getting is a little flavoring, which, won't hurt anything, but you're getting citric acid and you're getting food coloring. And so you can color your wool in the microwave. The microwave provides the heat with Kool-Aid. So, I mean, and people do it all the time. So it's not hard to do. Obviously, humanity's been doing it for a long time. And actually, which brings me back to do you mind if I talk just a quick second about natural dyes? Okay.
Yes. I mean, I don't mind.
Okay.
Yes, continue.
Okay. The question I get asked a lot is about natural dyes. And, because obviously we want to do what's right for the planet and we want to, be as friendly, to this place we're living on as we can. But one thing to understand about natural dyes is that even if the dye materials themselves are non-toxic, which isn't always the case, it's the mordants. So natural dyes usually you have to have something else you're adding into it to get the color to stick to the fiber. And those are called mordants. And so I just want to put out a word of caution out there that if you're doing natural dyeing, a lot of times, many of those mordants or even the materials you're dyeing with are very toxic. And so it's not necessarily as friendly as you think it is. Again, that Kool-Aid that's made with citric acid may actually be more eco-friendly in some ways than, some of the natural materials. It doesn't mean you shouldn't use them, and it doesn't mean you can't use them responsibly, but just be careful. Make sure you always wear gloves because you can absorb, of course, chemicals through your skin. And that's true of all dyes. Even if you're working with citric acid, just please wear gloves. Please, if it's in a powder form, please put on a mask. And when I say mask, I mean a good old K95, because some of those dye particles are so fine, they really can affect your lungs. If you're going to do dyeing of textiles, please use proper precautions, especially if you're working with powdered dyes. And just, again, just because it's natural does not mean it's necessarily better for the environment. I mean, once upon a time, basically all paints and dyes were natural, and we know what kind of pollution they left behind. So just, try to weigh all the pros and cons and be aware of, what substances you're using and the toxicity. So, be careful out there. Use proper tools and protect yourself.
Oh, Katrina, we've come to the end of our time for this episode, but I want to thank you for all of the wisdom that you shared. It's been fascinating. And I want to encourage people to check out your websites. That's spoiledsheep.com. And can they find you on social media?
Yes. Well, the spoiled sheep aren't really on social media. I only have so much product. I only have so much. Well, number one, because I'm lazy. I mean, they do have social media. I just never do it because I'm terrible. KatrinaWalker.com. I do actually have an employee who does my social media. So it's the one employee I have. So yes, I can be found Katrina Walker, and it's usually So Katrina or something, or So Fashionable, or, something similar like that. You can find it on my website. There are links, KatrinaWalker.com. But yes, so I'm on all the social media, but the sheep mostly are not, partly because I only have so much product to sell. So if they got too popular, I'd actually be in a hard place, because the biggest problem now is finding processors for my wool. And so my local processor has gone out of business. So I'm searching for a new yarn producer. It's challenging.
Oh, I hope you find somebody. I'm sorry, this is going off on a new vein of topic, but the shearer, do you have like a local shearer or somebody who is on a circuit? Because I follow some shearers on social media who travel around the country on a circuit. It's fascinating to me.
One of our previous shearers has sheared in the Falkland Islands even. He's literally sheared the world. And so it's a really kind of a cool, even in this day and age, it's still a very relevant career path. It helps to be short and strong. It's not necessary, but most shearers tend to be not real tall and very, very strong. But I mean, I know a female shearer who I knew when she was growing up in 4-H, who's about my height, 5'10", and she does a great job. So you don't have to be a guy and you don't have to be short, but it helps. But we actually, our local shearer, we have several. One's just up the road, but the one we have currently, he shears pretty much all over the Pacific Northwest, and he shears year round. I mean, it is his full-time profession, and he really is committed to shearing the small flocks like mine, because if you have a small flock, it pretty much is usually kind of a circuit thing, because frankly, you don't have enough sheep to keep him busy. But whereas one of my vets runs 1,000 head of ewes. And so she's got over 1,000 sheep to clip at any given time. And so then you have commercial shearing crews that come in and shear. So it just depends on the size of your operation.
I have a half-acre field. Is that enough for one sheep or two sheep? Can I fit in some sheep here?
Oh, heavens, yes. sheep don't take up, I mean, people raise sheep in relatively small pens. My niece's flock was probably on maybe a half acre at best, but they still had enough room to, they moved around. They had things to browse on. The thing is, Sarah, is that you actually could probably have, so on your little half acre, you could probably have several sheep because you're in a part of the country where you actually get moisture. Whereas our sheep pasture is probably about 35 acres. And we're down to about a dozen sheep in our flock right now. We've had as much as 25, but we still, with only 12 sheep on 30 some acres, we have to feed starting in August because it's dried up. There's nothing left. And so they have to have grazing. So, and we irrigate. That's even with some irrigation, we still cannot go without, okay, if we made them go out and look for food, they could, there is actually some stuff up there in the woods, but they're not going to go looking for it because it's my sheep. So we do start feeding them when it gets really dry. But I mean, we could make them work harder, but anyhow, it's where you are absolutely certainly could. And especially if you have, hay producers in the area, sheep, they really aren't, it's not like having, like my ex racehorse who likes to go out and run around the pasture. So, I mean, they really don't care about exercise that much. So I think as long as they have food, they're pretty happy. They don't really require much space in terms of, they seem pretty content to have food, and they spend a lot of their time digesting their food. So they chew they're ruminant meaning they have multiple stomachs. So they eat it, they barf it back up, they chew it again, they barf, swallow it back down again, and it goes through the system. So they spend a fair amount of time, barfing up their food and re-chewing it. So that's what chewing their cud is. So they spend plenty of time doing that too. You can tell I'm a farm girl. Nothing grosses me out, but that's how it works. But yeah, absolutely. And upstate New York, heavens, yes. Just watch your parasites. Make sure that you worm regularly because you're going to have, especially if they're on a smaller area, if they brought parasites in, it's going to be in the soil more easily. Yada yada yada. So you just have to watch your flock management is all. Yeah, they'd be perfectly happy. I'm sure they would be thrilled to be your little buddies, and they'd all baw every time you went outside, just like mine.
I would love to have some sheep.
I think
you definitely made me think about it some more. I think I need some sheep.
You look at Rhinebeck, you might have lambs there.
Well, Katrina, thanks again for talking with me. And I'm going to have links to some wonderful articles in the show notes. And I want to thank everyone for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks, Katrina. Bye.
Thank you to our guest for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send your comments, questions, and suggestions to th@taunton.com. And please like, comment, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps others find our podcast. Until next time, keep on sewing with threads.